The unexpected encounter. The afternoon sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the quiet rural road. James Westfield, a middle-aged businessman with a polished suit and a reputation for ruthless efficiency, sat behind the wheel of his sleek black SUV. He was a man of habit, a man who thrived on control and precision. His life was filled with high-stakes deals, and he rarely let anything, or anyone, slow him down. But today was different. A loud pop echoed from beneath his vehicle, followed by the unmistakable shudder of his car slowing down, jolting to one side. A flat tire. James muttered a string of curses under his breath, pulling over onto the narrow shoulder of the deserted road. He stepped out of the SUV, surveying the shredded remains of his rear tire with a frown. This wasn't just a minor setback. He was in the middle of nowhere, far from his usual world of high-rise buildings and bustling city streets. The rural landscape around him seemed almost mocking, silent except for the occasional rustle of wind through the nearby fields. James looked around, feeling a rare sense of vulnerability. He tried his phone, but of course, there was no signal. He sighed, glancing down at his suit and polished leather shoes. He hadn't changed a tire in years, if ever, and certainly wasn't about to ruin his expensive attire attempting it now. The minutes ticked by as he stood there, alternating between scanning the road and checking his watch. There was no sign of another car, let alone someone who could assist him. For the first time in a long while, he felt helpless. Then, in the distance, he spotted movement, a figure approaching on foot, small at first, then gradually becoming more distinct as it drew closer. It was a young boy, no older than 15, dressed in worn jeans and a faded t-shirt, with a well-worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. The boy's steps were casual, but purposeful, as though he knew exactly where he was going. "Need some help, mister?" the boy called out as he got within earshot, flashing a friendly, toothy grin. James hesitated, taking in the boy's appearance with a hint of suspicion. He wasn't used to strangers approaching him in such a casual, friendly manner. In his world, people only helped if they were getting something in return. He eyed the boy warily. "Yeah, I've got a flat," he replied curtly, gesturing to the tire. "You wouldn't happen to know how to change one, would you?" The boy chuckled, as though the question was somehow amusing. "Sure, my dad taught me." "Got a spare?" James nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and discomfort. He stepped aside, allowing the boy access to the back of the SUV. The kid opened the hatch and pulled out the spare tire and tools with an ease that surprised James. He worked quickly, loosening the bolts and lifting the car with the jack, all while humming a soft tune under his breath. As the boy worked, James found himself oddly transfixed. This young kid, with no hesitation, was helping him without asking for anything in return. It was such a foreign concept to him, a man who'd built his life on transactions and deals, that it left him slightly unsettled. "What's your name, kid?" James asked, more to fill the silence than out of genuine curiosity. "Dant," the boy replied without looking up, focusing on the task at hand. "Dant Martin." James nodded, watching as Dant expertly maneuvered the tools. The kid was efficient, clearly familiar with the work. James realized he was unused to seeing this kind of dedication, especially in someone so young. The people in his life, the people he employed, were motivated by the paychecks he provided, not by any genuine willingness to help. "Where do you live, Dante?" James asked after a moment. "Not far from here," Dant replied, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "My family's got a little place down the road. I walk around here a lot." As Dante tightened the last bolt on the spare tire, he stood up, dusting off his hands on his jeans. "All done," he said, stepping back and giving James a thumbs up. "Should get you where you need to go." James reached into his wallet, pulling out a crisp $50 bill. He held it out to Dante. "Here, for your trouble." But Dante shook his head, taking a step back. "I don't need your money, mister," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Just wanted to help." James stared at the boy, his hand frozen in midair. In his world, money was the ultimate tool. It solved problems, closed deals, and made people happy. Yet here was this kid, rejecting his money without a second thought. "Are you sure?" James asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "You could buy something nice for yourself." Dant simply smiled, giving James a quick wave. "I'm good, mister. Take care." And with that, he turned and began walking back down the road, his figure gradually shrinking into the distance until it disappeared around a bend. James climbed back into his SUV, still holding the $50 bill in his hand. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the empty road ahead of him. The encounter had left him feeling strangely unsettled, as though Dant's kindness had upended some deeply ingrained belief he held about people. In his mind, everyone had a price. But apparently, Dante didn't. As he drove away, James couldn't shake the image of the boy's smile, the unspoken message that some things couldn't be bought. It was a new experience for him, one that lingered in his thoughts for the rest of the drive. By the time he returned home, the encounter with Dante had faded into the background, yet a small part of him continued to dwell on it. He went through his usual routine: dinner with his wife, catching up on emails, preparing for the next day's meetings. But that night, as he lay in bed, he found himself replaying the moment in his mind, unable to fully dismiss it. The next morning, he woke up with a strange sense of anticipation, though he couldn't quite place why. As he sipped his coffee, a sudden rumble outside drew his attention. He stood up, walking to the window, and his eyes widened. A sleek, black SUV, very similar to his own, was parked outside his gate. It wasn't his vehicle, and he didn't recognize the driver, who wore a plain black suit and aviator sunglasses. The man got out, glanced at a clipboard, and approached the door. James's wife, Eleanor, appeared in the doorway, looking concerned. "Are you expecting someone, James?" "No, not at all," he replied, frowning. He set down his coffee, curiosity piquing, as he went to open the door. The man in the suit gave him a polite nod. "Mr. Westfield." "Yes. And you are?" The man handed him a simple white envelope, then stepped back. "This is for you, courtesy of Dante Martin." And with that, he turned, walked back to the SUV, and drove off without another word. James stared at the envelope in his hand, feeling a strange mix of confusion and intrigue. Who was this kid, really? And why was he sending people to his house? He slowly opened the envelope, revealing a handwritten note inside. The words were simple but powerful. "Sometimes, helping someone is enough to change their life. Thank you for letting me help you." James's hand shook slightly as he folded the note back into the envelope. He looked down the street where the SUV had disappeared, feeling a warmth in his chest that was both foreign and comforting. In that moment, he realized he'd just received a gift far more valuable than any money he could offer, an unexpected glimpse into the power of simple, selfless kindness. An unsettling mystery. James stood on his front porch, the morning sun casting a warm glow on the envelope in his hands. The elegant, carefully penned message was short, yet it seemed to hold layers of meaning that he couldn't quite grasp. "Thank you for letting me help you." The words echoed in his mind, unsettling him in a way he couldn't easily dismiss. Who exactly was Dante Martin? James couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the boy than met the eye. The mere fact that a young teenager had not only helped him but rejected any form of payment was already enough to leave a mark. But sending a black SUV with a suited man as the messenger added an element of mystery he hadn't anticipated. As he reread the note, Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, her arms crossed, a look of mild amusement on her face. "So, are you going to explain why a mysterious man just handed you a note, or is this going to be one of those secret James Westfield deals?" James gave her a half-smile, knowing his wife would press until she got answers. Eleanor had always been the inquisitive type, her sharp mind both his greatest ally and occasional frustration. He handed her the note, watching as her eyebrows knit together in concentration. "Dant Martin," she murmured, looking up at him. "Isn't he the boy you mentioned yesterday? The one who helped with the flat tire?" James nodded, his gaze distant. "Yes, but I don't understand why he'd go out of his way to send someone here with a note. It doesn't make sense. Why not just let it be?" Eleanor considered this, biting her lip thoughtfully. "Maybe he's just one of those people who believes in small acts of kindness, you know. Maybe he wanted to remind you that not everyone has an agenda." She smiled, trying to lift the weight of confusion from his face. James nodded, though he couldn't fully accept her explanation. He was a man of logic and pragmatism, and in his experience, nothing was ever truly selfless. Yet here was this kid who had given him help without asking for anything, and then had sent a thank you note, as though he had been the one receiving a favor. The idea gnawed at him, challenging everything he thought he understood about the world. That day, James couldn't focus on his work. During his meetings, he found his thoughts drifting back to the note and the boy who had changed his tire. He replayed the memory over and over. The casual way Dant had shrugged off the money, his bright smile, and the confident way he'd simply walked away. It was as though Dant had left a thread hanging, a loose end in the well-ordered fabric of James's life, and he couldn't rest until he pulled it and saw where it led. By evening, James's curiosity had grown into something more potent, a need for answers. He found himself scouring local directories, searching for anything he could find about Dant Martin. After what felt like hours of scrolling through outdated listings, he finally located a possible match. Dant lived just a few miles away, in a modest house on the edge of town. The sparse details he found online indicated that Dant lived with his mother, and that they had been in the area for a few years. Beyond that, there wasn't much information. No school profiles, no social media presence. It was as though the kid had slipped through the cracks, living a quiet, unnoticed life. The next morning, James rose early, his mind already set on visiting Dant's home. Eleanor watched him with a raised eyebrow as he prepared to leave, an amused smirk on her lips. "You're really going to hunt down this kid, aren't you?" James shrugged, trying to appear casual. "I just want to thank him properly. It's just something I need to do." Eleanor laughed, shaking her head. "All right, just don't scare him off. Remember, not everyone lives in your world, James." He smiled and gave her a quick kiss before heading out the door, feeling a mixture of anticipation and nerves. As he drove through the quiet streets, he wondered what exactly he was hoping to find. Perhaps he simply wanted to satisfy his curiosity, or maybe he needed to prove to himself that there was nothing remarkable about Dant Martin. When he finally pulled up outside Dant's house, he was surprised by the modesty of it. The small, single-story home was painted a faded shade of blue, with a yard that looked as though it hadn't seen a lawnmower in weeks. A rusty bicycle lay on its side near the porch, and a few wildflowers grew along the walkway, their colors vibrant against the otherwise unkempt lawn. James took a deep breath, feeling a momentary pang of doubt. Was he overstepping? Perhaps this was all unnecessary. But his curiosity won out, and he stepped out of his SUV, making his way up the short walkway to the front door. He raised his hand, knocking firmly. After a few moments, the door opened, revealing a woman in her early 40s, her face etched with the lines of someone who had seen her share of struggles. Her expression was cautious, but kind. "Can I help you?" she asked, her gaze flickering to James's tailored suit and polished shoes, marking him as an outsider in this part of town. "Good morning, ma'am. My name's James Westfield. I was hoping to speak with Dante. He helped me with a flat tire the other day, and I just wanted to thank him properly." The woman's eyes softened, and a small smile touched her lips. "Dante's not here right now. He's at school, but I appreciate you stopping by. He mentioned you yesterday, actually. Said he met a man who seemed like he needed a little help." James chuckled, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. That sounds about right. He was a lifesaver, really. I just wanted to express my gratitude. She nodded, folding her arms. Dante doesn't usually talk much about the people he helps, you know. But he mentioned you, said you seemed a little lost. James blinked, taken aback. Lost? No, I was just stranded with a flat tire. Nothing more than that. The woman gave him a knowing smile, as though she saw something in him that he hadn't yet recognized himself. Well, Dante has a way of seeing things. He's always been like that, even as a little boy. He believes everyone has something they're searching for, even if they don't realize it themselves. James shifted uncomfortably, feeling as though this simple visit had taken on a far deeper meaning than he'd intended. He wasn't used to people seeing him this way, to having his carefully constructed facade pierced by a boy he barely knew. "Tell Dante I stopped by," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. "And tell him thank you. I don't know why, but it means more than I thought." The woman nodded, her eyes warm. "I'll let him know. And Mr. Westfield, if you're ever in need of a friend, Dante's always willing to help. He has a big heart, even if life hasn't always been kind to him." As James walked back to his car, he felt a strange ache in his chest, a sense of longing that he couldn't quite place. It was as though this brief conversation had opened a door he hadn't even realized existed, leading him into a part of himself he'd long buried beneath ambition and success. For the next few days, James tried to return to his normal life, but he found himself haunted by the encounter. Dante's simple kindness and his mother's words seemed to follow him everywhere, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He began to notice things he previously ignored. The tired faces of his employees, the distant look in his wife's eyes, the silence in his large, empty house. One evening, he sat in his study, staring at the photo of himself and Eleanor from their wedding day. They'd been so young, so hopeful. But somewhere along the way, he'd lost that part of himself, trading it for wealth and status. He wondered what Dante would think if he could see him now, if he'd sensed the emptiness that had slowly taken root inside him. Unable to sleep, James found himself in his car, driving aimlessly through the city. Before he knew it, he was on that same rural road where he'd met Dante. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the landscape, and he could almost see the boy's smiling face in the distance. As he drove, a plan began to form in his mind, a way to repay Dante, not with money or favors, but with something far more meaningful. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of purpose, a reason to reach beyond himself and truly connect with another person. And so, as the stars began to dot the evening sky, James turned his car around, his heart pounding with anticipation. He didn't know exactly how he would do it, but he was determined to give Dante a gift as profound as the one he had unknowingly given him. A chance to change someone's life, just as his own had been changed. The gift of perspective. James returned home that night feeling something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose beyond his day-to-day existence, beyond deals and figures and profit margins. Dante had given him something intangible, something he couldn't put a price on. And now, James was determined to give back in a way that would truly matter. The next morning, James woke up early, fueled by a restless energy. He didn't tell Eleanor about his plans, not because he wanted to hide them, but because he wasn't sure how to explain this newfound resolve. How could he describe to his wife that a simple encounter on a deserted road had shaken his entire worldview? After a quick breakfast, James got in his car and drove back to the part of town where Dante lived. This time, he wasn't simply visiting to say thank you. He wanted to understand Dante's life, to know what kind of challenges the young boy faced, and how he could help. As he parked his car near Dante's home, he noticed a small group of children playing on the sidewalk, their laughter filling the quiet street. They watched him curiously as he approached, likely wondering what a well-dressed man in an expensive car was doing in their neighborhood. James smiled and gave a small wave, feeling out of place, but oddly at peace. Daunt's mother opened the door with a warm smile when she saw him. "Back again, Mr. Westfield." "Please, call me James," he replied, smiling back. "I was hoping to speak with Daunt, if he's around." She nodded, gesturing for him to come inside. The house was modest, but filled with warmth. Family photos lined the walls, and the faint smell of freshly baked bread hung in the air. James was struck by how different it felt from his own home, which was grand and pristine, but often felt cold and empty. "Dante's out back," his mother said, leading him through a small, cozy kitchen and out to the backyard. There, James found Daunt working on an old bicycle, his hands covered in grease as he tightened a bolt on the wheel. The boy looked up as James approached, his face breaking into a surprised smile. "Mr. Westfield, didn't expect to see you here again." James chuckled, feeling oddly shy in the presence of this young boy. "I told you to call me James, remember?" Daunt nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "All right, James. So, what brings you here?" James hesitated, unsure how to explain. I wanted to understand more about you. About your life. You've given me a lot to think about, Daunt. I'd like to find a way to give something back." Daunt tilted his head, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Give something back? You already tried to give me money, remember?" He said it with a teasing smile. But James could hear the underlying sincerity. "I know," James replied, "but I realized that money isn't the answer. You showed me something I'd forgotten. A way of living that isn't all about transactions and rewards, and it's made me wonder if there's something more I can do." Daunt considered this, a thoughtful look crossing his face. "You really don't owe me anything, you know. I just helped because, well, that's what people should do, right?" James nodded, though a part of him still struggled with the simplicity of that idea. In his world, kindness without a price tag was rare, and here was this boy offering it freely, without expectation. "But," Daunt continued, glancing over at his mother, who was watching them from the kitchen window with a smile, "if you really want to understand, maybe you can spend some time with me. Get a feel for what my life is like." James blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected this response, but he felt an inexplicable urge to say yes. I'd like that," he said slowly, feeling a sense of humility that was unfamiliar to him. And so, over the next few days, James found himself returning to Daunt's neighborhood, learning about the boy's world in ways that both surprised and humbled him. Dante took him to the small park where he and his friends played basketball with a worn-out ball. He showed James the old library he loved, where he spent hours reading whatever books he could find. And, most poignantly, Dante introduced him to people in his community, neighbors, friends, and even strangers, who had shaped his life in ways large and small. One afternoon, as they walked through a local food market, Dante pointed out a stall run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Alvarez. Her stall was filled with handmade crafts, woven baskets, and colorful scarves. Dante explained that Mrs. Alvarez had lived in the neighborhood for decades, raising her grandchildren after her own children had moved away. "She's like a grandma to everyone around here," Dante said with a fond smile. "Sometimes she even gives away food for free if she knows someone's struggling." James watched Mrs. Alvarez greet each customer with a warm smile and a kind word, marveling at her generosity. It was a stark contrast to the transactional world he was accustomed to, and it filled him with a strange sense of longing, a desire to be part of something bigger than himself. "People here seem different," James said, his voice quiet. "They care about each other." Dante nodded, looking up at him with a knowing smile. "That's just how it is here. We don't have much, but we look out for each other. It's not about what you can get, it's about what you can give." James felt a lump in his throat, and he found himself wondering how he'd drifted so far from that simple truth. He had spent his life building a fortress of wealth and power, convinced that it would bring him happiness. But here, in this humble community, he was discovering a depth of connection and meaning that had eluded him for years. One evening, after spending the day helping Don's mother repaint their front porch, James sat on the steps, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Dant sat beside him, sipping a can of soda, his face relaxed and content. "You know," James said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I used to think that success was all about climbing to the top, being the best, having the most. But now I'm not so sure." Dant looked at him, his gaze steady. "Success isn't about what you have, James. It's about what you do with what you have. My mom always says that the greatest thing you can give someone is your time and your kindness." James nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle in his chest. He realized that he had been so focused on accumulating wealth that he had forgotten the value of simple human connection. And here was this boy, wise beyond his years, reminding him of truths he had long buried. As the days passed, James's life began to shift in subtle ways. He found himself spending more time with Eleanor, really listening to her, rather than going through the motions of married life. He started visiting his employees on the factory floor, asking about their families, taking an interest in their lives beyond work. Word of his visits spread, and he noticed a change in the atmosphere at his company. People seemed more engaged, more willing to go the extra mile. James had always believed that respect was something you earned through authority, but now he saw that true respect came from empathy and understanding. One Saturday morning, James decided to surprise Dante by taking him to a basketball game in the city. It was an extravagant gesture, but he wanted to show his appreciation in a way that felt meaningful. Dante was thrilled, and they spent the day cheering, laughing, and talking like old friends. After the game, as they drove back, Dante looked over at him with a serious expression. "You know, James, you've changed a lot since we met." James chuckled, feeling a twinge of embarrassment. "I guess I have. But it's all thanks to you, Dante. You reminded me of things I'd forgotten." Dante smiled, his gaze thoughtful. "Well, I'm glad I could help. But remember, it's up to you to keep it going. People can change, but it's the choices they make every day that matter." James nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility. He knew that this newfound understanding was only the beginning. He had a lifetime of habits to unlearn, a world of relationships to rebuild. But for the first time, he felt ready to face that challenge, knowing that he wasn't alone. That night, as James dropped Dante off at his home, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He waved goodbye, watching as Dante disappeared into the house, and he realized that the boy had given him more than he could ever repay. He had given him the gift of perspective, a gift that would shape the rest of his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The ripple effect. The following weeks were unlike anything James Westfield had ever experienced. As he immersed himself in Dante's world, he found his own changing in ways he hadn't anticipated. He began to see life through a lens he hadn't looked through in years, a lens of simplicity, community, and genuine human connection. It was as if a door had opened to a side of himself he'd long buried beneath ambition and success. One evening, while having dinner with Eleanor, he shared his experiences with her, trying to put into words how profoundly Dante and his community had impacted him. Eleanor listened intently, her eyes softening as she took in every word. "James," she said, reaching up to place her hand over his, "I can see the change in you. You're more present. I've missed this side of you." Her words struck him deeply, and for the first time, he truly understood the distance that had grown between them over the years. Success had cost him more than he'd realized, and now, sitting at the dinner table with his wife, he felt a profound sense of regret. But also, there was hope, a hope that he could rebuild the relationships he had neglected. That weekend, he decided to take things a step further. Inspired by Dante's community and the way they all looked out for each other, James began to think about the people in his own neighborhood. He lived in a gated community, surrounded by wealth and privilege, but the sense of unity and support he had seen in Dante's neighborhood was sorely lacking. Driven by a newfound sense of purpose, James drafted a plan. He would host a community event, An open gathering for all the residents, something that would encourage people to come together, connect, and support each other. It was a simple idea, but one he hoped would spark something meaningful. When he shared his idea with Eleanor, she looked at him with a mix of surprise and admiration. A community event? She asked, a smile tugging at her lips. You, the man who's always kept his distance from the neighbors, want to organize a get-together? James laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. I know it sounds out of character, but I feel like it's something I need to do. I want to bring people together, help them connect the way people in Don's community do. Maybe it's a small thing, but it feels right. Eleanor's smile widened, and she reached out to take his hand. Count me in. Let's do it together. With her support, James got to work. He spent days planning the event, coordinating with vendors for food, entertainment, and decorations. He visited each neighbor personally, handing out invitations and explaining his vision. Some looked at him skeptically, surprised by his sudden change in attitude, while others seemed genuinely pleased by the idea. As the date approached, James felt a nervous excitement building in him. This was something new, something outside his comfort zone, but he was committed. On the day of the event, James and Eleanor arrived early at the neighborhood park, setting up tables, arranging decorations, and greeting the vendors as they arrived. A sense of anticipation filled the air as they waited for the first guests to arrive. Slowly, people began to trickle in. Families with children, elderly couples, young professionals, all mingling together, chatting and laughing. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed, a stark contrast to the usual reserved demeanor that defined their neighborhood. As James watched the scene unfold, he felt a surge of pride. This was exactly what he had envisioned, a community coming together, sharing stories, forming connections. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. At one point, he noticed a group of children playing a game of tag, their laughter echoing across the park. Watching them, he was reminded of Dante, and a pang of longing struck him. He wished the boy could be here, to see the impact his kindness had inspired. But perhaps, James thought, this was Dante's gift, an invisible ripple that extended far beyond a single act. As the sun began to set, Eleanor approached him, a warm smile on her face. Look around you, James. This is because of you. James shook his head, feeling a mix of humility and pride. No, it's because of Dante. He showed me that true wealth isn't about money. It's about community, about the lives you touch. They stood together, watching as people continued to mingle, unaware of the deeper meaning this event held for James. For them, it was simply a pleasant evening, but for him, it was a symbol of transformation, a reminder of the boy who had taught him the power of human connection. As the evening wound down, James thanked each guest personally, exchanging smiles and handshakes, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. People expressed their gratitude, some even suggesting that this become an annual event, a tradition for their community. James agreed, a spark of hope kindling in his heart. Perhaps this was only the beginning. In the days that followed, James found himself reflecting on how he could continue this journey of change. The event had brought him closer to his neighbors, but he wanted to do more. He thought about his employees, the people who worked tirelessly to keep his business thriving. Many of them came from backgrounds similar to Don's, struggling to make ends meet while supporting their families. Inspired by his experiences, James decided it was time to make a change within his own company. He began by implementing new policies, better wages, flexible work hours, and scholarships for employees' children who wanted to pursue higher education. He set up a fund for emergency assistance, allowing employees to access financial aid in times of crisis. The changes were met with a mix of surprise and gratitude, and James could see the positive impact almost immediately. Morale improved, productivity increased, and the atmosphere in the office became one of mutual respect and camaraderie. One afternoon, as he was walking through the factory floor, James was approached by an older employee named Carl. Carl had worked for him for over 20 years, a quiet man who rarely spoke up but was known for his dedication and hard work. "Mr. Westfield," Carl said, his voice thick with emotion, "I just wanted to thank you for what you've done. My daughter's going to college next year, and because of the scholarship you set up, she won't have to worry about the costs. It means the world to us." James felt a lump form in his throat, and he reached out to shake Carl's hand. "Thank you, Carl, but you don't owe me any thanks. This is just something I should have done a long time ago." Carl nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. Well, it's never too late to make a difference. As James walked away, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. For years, he had measured his success by the size of his bank account, the power he wielded, the respect he commanded. But now, he saw that true success was measured by the lives he touched, the people he uplifted, the difference he made. One evening, a few weeks later, James received an unexpected visitor. He was just sitting down to dinner with Eleanor when the doorbell rang. He opened the door to find Dante standing on his porch, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Dante," James exclaimed, his face lighting up with genuine joy. "What brings you here?" Dante shrugged, his smile shy but warm. "I heard about the event you hosted, and all the changes you've made. People in my neighborhood are talking about it, you know. They're saying you're a new man." James chuckled, feeling a surge of gratitude. "I owe it all to you, Dante. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten." Dante nodded, then held out the package. "This is for you. Just a little thank you from me and my mom." James accepted the package, feeling a sense of reverence as he carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a simple wooden plaque, hand-carved with words that struck him to the core. "A life touched by kindness is a life transformed." For a moment, James couldn't speak, his eyes stinging with unexpected tears. He looked at Dante, seeing not just a boy but a wise soul, a guide who had led him back to his true self. "Thank you, Dante," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. This means more to me than you'll ever know." Dante smiled, and for a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, two souls from different worlds, bound by a shared understanding. As Dante walked away, James knew that this wasn't the end. His journey was just beginning, a journey of kindness, community, and purpose, and with each step he took, he carried Dante's lesson with him. A reminder that true wealth was measured not by what he owned, but by the lives he touched, the hope he inspired, and the legacy of kindness he left behind. A legacy of kindness. James found himself thinking more and more about his legacy. For years, he'd assumed that his wealth, his reputation, and his towering achievements in the corporate world would define how he'd be remembered. But now, thanks to Dante, he saw that true legacy wasn't about buildings with his name on them or titles he held. It was about the lives he had the power to impact, the good he could spread, and the way he could inspire others to keep kindness alive. Since Dante had re-entered his life with the humble gift of the plaque, James had kept it on his office desk, where he could see it every day. The words, "A life touched by kindness is a life transformed," had become his guiding principle, a reminder of what truly mattered. He found himself referring back to the phrase whenever he faced a decision, no matter how small, and it wasn't long before he noticed the ripple effect this had on those around him. One crisp autumn morning, James was invited to speak at a local high school. A friend on the school board had heard about the changes he'd been making and thought James's story could inspire students, many of whom came from underprivileged backgrounds. He was hesitant at first. Public speaking wasn't something he enjoyed, and sharing his personal journey felt daunting. But the thought of passing on Dante's message pushed him to accept. As he stood in the auditorium, facing rows of young faces, James felt a nervousness he hadn't experienced in years. The audience was filled with students, some attentive, some distracted, and a few visibly uninterested. He cleared his throat, his gaze settling on a group of teenagers near the front who were watching him intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Good morning, everyone," James began, feeling his usual confidence return as he spoke. "I'm here to share a story with you, one that changed my life." He recounted his encounter with Dante, the way the young boy had selflessly helped him with his flat tire, and the profound impact that single act of kindness had on his outlook. As he spoke, the room gradually quieted, students leaning forward in their seats, drawn into the story. For the first time, he saw how powerful a simple narrative could be, how it could connect people and open their hearts to ideas they might otherwise ignore. "And what I learned from Dante," James concluded, his voice strong but full of emotion, "is that kindness doesn't require wealth, status, or any special skills. It just requires the willingness to see people as they are, and to care for them without expecting anything in return. That's the kind of wealth that no one can take away from you, and it's a wealth you can share freely." He ended his speech with the words on the plaque, feeling a surge of pride as the students erupted into applause. It wasn't just polite clapping, either. It was a genuine, enthusiastic response, and James knew that Dante's message had reached them. As he left the stage, several students approached him, thanking him for his words and sharing their own stories of small kindnesses that had made a big difference in their lives. One young girl, probably no older than 15, stood in line waiting to talk to him. She had tears in her eyes when it was finally her turn. "Mr. Westfield," she said quietly, clutching her notebook tightly, "my mom works 2 jobs, and sometimes I feel like no one understands what it's like for us. But listening to you, it makes me feel like there's hope, like maybe people do care." James felt a lump form in his throat, and he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "People do care. And sometimes, even if it doesn't feel that way, there are more people who want to help than you realize. I'm glad my story could give you some hope." She smiled, wiping her eyes. "Thank you, sir. I won't forget what you said." As he left the school that day, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about his own transformation anymore. He wanted to create a world where kindness and understanding were common, where young people like that girl didn't feel alone in their struggles. Back at his company, James continued his mission of making a difference, not just through better wages and benefits, but through fostering a culture of compassion. He held weekly meetings with his employees, where he encouraged them to share their ideas, voice their concerns, and talk about their lives. He noticed that many of his workers seemed more relaxed, even joyful, knowing that their well-being mattered to him personally. One day, an employee named Lydia approached him in the break room, a look of nervous determination on her face. "Mr. Westfield," she said, her voice wavering slightly, "I just wanted to say thank you. My husband got sick last month, and if it weren't for the emergency fund, we wouldn't have been able to pay our rent. I never thought a CEO would care about people like me." James reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Lydia, it's people like you who make this company what it is. I'm just glad I could help. And please, call me James." She smiled, looking both relieved and touched. "Thank you, James. Really." He watched her walk away, feeling the now familiar warmth in his chest. Moments like these reminded him of the power of empathy, of how a single gesture of understanding could make a world of difference to someone in need. He thought about Dante often, wondering if the boy could sense the profound changes his actions had inspired. As the holiday season approached, James decided to organize a community outreach program. He wanted to give back to the neighborhood that had inspired his transformation, so he arranged for his company to sponsor a food and clothing drive in partnership with local charities. The plan was to provide holiday meals, warm clothing, and essential supplies to families in need. When James reached out to Dante's community, he was met with overwhelming enthusiasm. Many residents offered to volunteer, and the event quickly gained momentum. Word spread, and soon, people from all over town were pitching in to help. It became a town-wide effort, a gathering of individuals united by a shared desire to uplift those less fortunate. On the day of the event, James was overwhelmed by the turnout. Hundreds of people showed up, not just to receive aid, but to volunteer, to give their time and energy to make the event a success. The sight of so many people coming together, united by kindness, filled him with a sense of accomplishment that no business deal had ever given him. As he moved through the crowd, handing out boxes of food and warm blankets, he spotted a familiar face. Dot. The young boy was carrying a stack of winter coats, his face beaming with joy as he passed them out to families. James approached him, feeling a surge of gratitude for the boy who had changed his life. "Dante," he called, and the boy turned, his face lighting up when he saw James. "James, you made it," Dante exclaimed, giving him a quick hug, which James returned warmly. "I wouldn't miss this for the world," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You inspired all of this, Dante. I want you to know that." Dante laughed, shrugging modestly. "I just helped you change a tire." James shook his head, his gaze serious. "It was more than that, Dante. You reminded me of what really matters. And I'm not the only one. Look around, look at what you've started." They stood together, watching as people of all ages, races, and backgrounds worked side by side, sharing laughter and warmth in the crisp winter air. It was a moment of pure humanity, a testament to the power of kindness to bridge divides and bring people together. As the event wound down, James found himself speaking with one of the organizers, a woman named Carla who had been instrumental in mobilizing volunteers. She approached him with a smile, a look of deep appreciation in her eyes. "James," she said, "you've done something incredible here. You've reminded people of the goodness that still exists in the world. We need more leaders like you." He smiled, feeling humbled. "Thank you, Carla. But the truth is, I'm just following Dante's example. This young man," he gestured toward Dante, "has taught me more about life and leadership than any business mentor ever could." Carla's gaze softened as she looked at Dante, who was still busy handing out blankets to a line of children. "Well, then you're both an inspiration," she said. As the evening drew to a close, James stood with Eleanor and Dante, watching as the last few families made their way home. His heart felt full in a way he hadn't known was possible, filled with a deep gratitude for the journey he'd taken, for the people he'd met, and for the boy who had shown him a new path. When they finally packed up and prepared to leave, Dante gave James one last hug. "Thank you, James," he said softly, "for everything." James knelt down, looking Dante in the eyes. "No, Dante. Thank you. You've changed my life in ways I can't even put into words. And I promise you, I'll keep paying it forward." Dante smiled, a wise look in his eyes. "That's all I wanted, James. Just keep spreading kindness." As James and Eleanor drove home that night, hand in hand, he knew that Dante's legacy would live on, not just in his life, but in the lives of everyone who had been touched by that simple act of kindness on a dusty rural road. It was a legacy that would ripple through the world, one person at a time, carried forward by those who understood that true wealth lay in the kindness they shared. A new dawn. In the weeks following the holiday event, James felt a sense of fulfillment that had been missing in his life for as long as he could remember. Everywhere he looked, he saw the impact of his transformation, the difference it was making in his family, his company, and his community. People who once saw him as merely a wealthy businessman now looked up to him as a leader of compassion and integrity. And he knew that all of this had begun with a single unexpected act of kindness from a boy on a dusty rural road. As the new year began, James resolved to keep that momentum going. He and Eleanor started a foundation focused on supporting underprivileged youth, providing scholarships, mentorship, and access to resources that would help them achieve their dreams. The foundation became a family project, with Eleanor helping to manage the programs and their children volunteering their time. It was a way for them to bond as a family, to work together for something bigger than themselves, and to carry forward the lessons James had learned from Dante. James also found himself spending more time in Dante's community, developing friendships with people he once might have overlooked. He helped organize more community events, fundraisers, and programs that provided resources for families in need. He became a familiar face in the neighborhood, someone people trusted and respected not for his money, but for his genuine desire to help. One chilly February afternoon, as James was walking down the street in Dante's neighborhood, he noticed a group of children huddled around something near the playground. Curious, he approached, hearing laughter and excited chatter. When he reached the children, he saw that they were surrounding Dante, who was kneeling on the ground, showing them how to make paper airplanes. "Hey, James," Dante called out, waving him over. "Wanna join us?" James laughed, nodding as he stepped closer. He crouched down beside Dante, picking up a sheet of paper and folding it under Dante's careful instruction. For a few minutes, he lost himself in the simple joy of teaching the kids, feeling a sense of camaraderie that warmed him on that cold day. After a while, the children scattered, running off with their newly made airplanes, leaving James and Dante alone. They sat on a nearby bench, watching the children play, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. "You know," James said, glancing at Dante, "you've taught me more than I ever thought possible. My life is different now because of you." Dante smiled, his gaze focused on the children. "It wasn't me, James. You did all of this yourself. I just reminded you of what you already had inside." James was silent for a moment, taking in Dante's words. He realized that the boy was right. This transformation had come from within him, a rediscovery of the values he'd once held before ambition had clouded his vision. But without Dante, he might never have found his way back. A few days later, James received a call from the local newspaper. They had heard about his work in the community and wanted to write a feature story about him, celebrating the impact he was making. James was reluctant at first. He hadn't done any of this for recognition. But after some thought, he realized that the story could inspire others to follow his example, to understand the power of kindness and community. On the day of the interview, James met with the journalist, a young woman named Maya, at his office. She asked him about his life, his career, and his recent transformation. James spoke openly, sharing his journey from a self-centered businessman to someone who valued people over profits. He spoke of Dante's kindness, how a simple act had changed everything for him, and how he hoped to pay it forward for the rest of his life. When the article was published, the response was overwhelming. People from all over the city reached out, wanting to volunteer, donate, or simply express their admiration for the work he was doing. James received letters from people he had never met, sharing their own stories of transformation and kindness, and telling him how his story had inspired them. One letter, however, stood out. It was from a man named Harold, a retired teacher who had once taught at Dante's elementary school. In the letter, Harold shared a story that James hadn't known, a story that made his heart ache with both sorrow and admiration. Harold explained that Dante's father had passed away when he was just 7 years old. His father had been a kind man, someone who was always helping neighbors, fixing cars for free, and teaching children how to ride bikes. He had been the heart of the community, a man who believed in giving without expecting anything in return. When he passed, the neighborhood had mourned deeply, and Dante's family had struggled financially and emotionally. But despite the hardships, Dante had carried on his father's legacy, embodying the same kindness and generosity that his father had shown. Tears filled James's eyes as he read the letter, understanding now why Dante had helped him so selflessly that day on the road. He wasn't just a boy offering help. He was a son honoring his father's memory, a young man shaped by the lessons of love and compassion he had learned from a man he had lost too soon. That evening, James visited Dante's home, holding the letter from Harold. He knocked on the door, feeling a mixture of sadness and gratitude. Dante's mother answered, her warm smile welcoming him in. "I came to share something with Dante," James said, holding up the letter. It's about his father. Dante joined them in the living room, his eyes curious as James handed him the letter. As he read, James watched the emotions flicker across his face: surprise, sadness, and then a quiet pride. "My dad," Dante murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at James, his eyes glistening with tears. I always wanted to be like him, you know. He taught me that kindness was the most important thing in the world." James placed a comforting hand on Dante's shoulder. "You are like him, Dante. You've been carrying on his legacy every day. And because of you, I've been able to change my own life. Your father would be incredibly proud." They sat together in silence, the weight of the moment settling over them. It was a profound realization for both of them, that kindness, even in the face of hardship, had the power to transcend generations, to ripple outward and touch lives they might never even see. As the weeks turned into months, James continued his work, but now with a new purpose. He dedicated the foundation to Dante's father, creating a scholarship program for young people who embodied kindness and selflessness. He named it the Martin Legacy Fund, a tribute to the man who had inspired Dante, and through him, changed James's life. Every year, James and Dante would award scholarships to young people who had made a difference in their communities, honoring their spirit of generosity and compassion. They would invite the recipients and their families to an annual ceremony, where James would share his story, reminding everyone that one act of kindness could change the world. In time, the Martin Legacy Fund grew, attracting donors and volunteers from across the country. People resonated with the message, inspired by the idea that kindness was a legacy worth passing down. James's life became a testament to that message, his transformation a beacon of hope for anyone who believed in the power of change. One evening, several years after their first encounter on the road, James and Dante stood together at the annual scholarship ceremony, watching as young recipients received their awards. Dante had grown into a confident young man, wise beyond his years, his eyes shining with pride as he watched the legacy of his father live on. As the last recipient accepted their award, Dante turned to James, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. "Thank you, James, for everything." James smiled, placing a hand on Dante's shoulder. "No, Dante. Thank you. Because of you, I found a purpose I never knew I was missing. You reminded me of the power of kindness, and now that kindness will live on long after we're gone." They stood together, two men from different worlds, united by a simple act of compassion that had transformed their lives. And as they looked out over the crowd, they knew that the legacy of kindness would continue, passed down through every life it touched, a light that would never fade. The story of James Westfield and Dante Martin became more than just a story. It became a movement, a reminder that true wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we give away. And in that simple truth, they had found the path to a life well lived, a legacy that would endure, and a new dawn filled with hope and love for generations to come. The end.